because
I will.
cool things are coming. So see you around. And now to the next keynote. So guys, we covered pricing, we covered policy. So now let's move to the topic, which was, I think, the hottest topic, especially at the beginning of the year, especially in January, where when Google shared their plans to phase out the third-party cookies in Chrome by 2022. And again, we are talking about that with our publishers, but we know we are not the experts of the experts. We have that kind of an expert today with us because he's talking all around the internet about third-party cookies and how to monetize the browsers where they're missing, and what to do to protect your businesses. For me, when if someone wakes me up at the midnight and asks me about my connotations, associations with third-party cookies, about names and companies, Mathieu Roche and ID5 is, I think, top of my mind in terms of the answers. So I have a huge pleasure to host Mathieu Roche, CEO of ID5, here today with us, and he will tell us more about how we can monetize the cookie-less traffic and how we can protect ourselves from what's coming. Hi, Mathieu.
Hi, how are you?
Good, good. Happy to
I'm very sorry to wake you up at midnight, or that you're thinking about me when you wake up at midnight. I don't know if this is a positive thing.
I don't know too, but really honest question, honest answer. ID5, you know, you guys are the first company I get to know when I started looking into the third-party cookie demise matters. So I'm really happy to meet you. Not in person, unfortunately, but still to meet you and have an opportunity to chat with you. So the stage is yours. Please do your magic, and hopefully we can learn from you and get something from your wisdom. Thanks.
Thank you for the warm introduction. I am going to try and share my screen.
Yep, we see it.
You see it, perfect. Technology is working. Unlike most of the things that have been happening in identity over the past few years, and why it's becoming such an important problem. So thank you for the invitation. Really happy to be speaking with you here today on a topic that, as you said, I seem to be rambling about, or have been rambling about for the past 3 years. Which was a much less popular topic 3 years ago, but has gained popularity as we've seen that identification, the foundation of digital advertising, is becoming increasingly difficult, which is putting a lot of businesses at risk. Publishers, obviously, but brands as well. They're at risk of becoming too dependent of only a handful of platforms where they can actually identify and target their users. So it's really important that we have an open discussion about identity, what we can do today, and what companies like ID5 are building tomorrow. Just in terms of a quick introduction, so ID5 is an identity company. I guess that's obvious from my introduction so far. And our mission is to build an infrastructure that is privacy first, because privacy is table stakes today, right? We have to involve users in that discussion, and we have to take their preference into consideration. So our mission is really to build a privacy first identity infrastructure to enable publishers to continue to live off of advertising, and really maintain an open web of free access to content and services on the web powered by advertising. So in a privacy first manner, really taking users' privacy at heart, and actually building privacy by design approach. I'll talk about that in a minute. To enable publishers to continue to sell advertising. Most publishers online today will know that it's a 2 to 3x difference between identifiable users and non-identifiable users in terms of valuation. And also to enable brands and agencies to have an efficient access to the population that is available on those publishers' websites, because a world in which only a couple of platforms are efficient destinations for investment dollars isn't a good world for anyone. So let's talk about identity, and first let's talk about what is identity, because it's become a bit of a buzzword over the past 6 to 12 months, but it's actually a complicated topic. In our framework, we see identity as a 3-dimensional topic. starting from the top, you need to be able to understand, to differentiate devices, right? I'm connecting here through a laptop. I also have a smartphone. I have a connected television. Those are 3 different devices. If I want to be identifiable, my device need to be identifiable. So I need a device ID. On top of those device IDs, some people will want to know that it's always me on those 3 device ID, right? And so connecting those devices together, working on what we call cross-device or people-based approach, so it's going one step up from the device into the user level, is another dimension of identity. And then knowing that it's me, Mathieu Roche, and not just XYZ, is also important, because I might be a customer of British Airways, I might be a customer of Gap, and so those brands will want to know that it's me, so that they can address me as a client that they know, right? So those are really the 3 different layers, or the 3 different dimensions of identity that we're talking about. And that the one that we're going to discuss today is really the device ID layer, because this is the one that's at risk. It's what is being challenged today is the ability to have a unique identifier that is always the same on a device. In mobile apps, we've been using IDFAs for that. On the web, we've been using cookies for that, and we know that those storage mechanisms, those identification mechanisms, are going away. Why is it an important topic? As I said earlier, because basically half of the value of digital advertising is based on identification. If you cannot identify users, if you cannot identify devices or people, you lose a lot of the value that brands are ready to invest in digital advertising. Around 50%, according to some estimates and research from Google, or Facebook issued something similar. I think BitSwitch, IP on Web did a similar evaluation. If you strip away cookie, if you take IDFAs out, the value of advertising becomes much lower. And there's a lot of business to depend on that. And again, there's the entire business model of the open web that depends on that. So it's very valuable, and the only ones who really have been able to identify users at scale and in a consistent manner have been the walled gardens, right? There's no mystery as to why they are able to gather such a big part of brands' investments globally. It's because they can identify users, because they can control the delivery of campaigns, they can target users, they can onboard customer databases. The estimate of the revenue generated by Facebook only using custom audience, which is a 100% identity-based service, is of $20 billion a year in revenue, right? So we're really talking about a big problem, or a big opportunity if you look at it with a glass half full type of mindset. So on the web, we've been using third-party cookies for, since the beginning of digital advertising, which has been a solution, but not a great solution, right? Looking at it from different perspective, it's very difficult to make third-party cookies privacy compliant. By definition, they are accessible to third parties, right? And a lot of people have access to the page, which means that controlling who has access to what information with what purpose is very complicated. The nature of third-party cookies opens a lot of risks of data leakage. People have access to your doors and your windows are open, right? People have access to your site. They can collect information, user IDs, but they can also collect refer. They can collect content categories, and they don't have to do that. They might be able to do that without your agreement. So that's another problem of using third-party cookies. Performance issues are another massive problem. There's over 50 to 100 cookie syncing pixels that are being fired on every single page in most websites on the internet, which means that it slows down those pages. They load much slower, right? So again, a massive problem. The biggest one potentially being the value loss, because to connect a publisher to a brand through a number of technical layers, technical solutions, everybody speaking different languages, everybody having different IDs on the same user, we need to go through cookie matching. And cookie matching doesn't scale very well, right? Match rates are anywhere between 70, 80% between the biggest platforms, all the way down to 30, 40 to 40%, right? So at every step of the way, when an audience goes from a publisher to an ad exchange to a DMP, then to a DSP, to a DMP, to overlay audience data on top of it, we're losing a lot of information at every step of the way. In the end, the brand will only be able to recognize maybe 30 or 40% of the audience that would have been available on the publisher if they had all been using the same language. And finally, the elephant in the room, obviously, third-party cookies are accessible in some browsers, less and less. We know that Safari was kind of early into that strategy of blocking access to third-party cookies. Firefox a year ago blocked access to third-party cookies, and Google has said, Chrome has said that we're going to block access to third-party cookies as well in the near future. So again, growing challenges around the use of third-party cookies wasn't necessarily great before, becoming even more difficult and potentially actually impossible, which means that in the future, if we don't have access to third-party cookies, we cannot do audience profiling and targeting, right? You cannot collect information about users if you don't have an ID on those users. And today, IDs are stored on third-party cookies. We cannot do frequency capping. To know that a user has already been exposed to 3 ads on 3 different websites, you need to have an ID on that user to connect that information. And last and probably not least at all, maybe even first, measurement attribution. This is a massive, massive use case for brands. The main reason why they invest on digital is because they can measure the ROI. And if they cannot measure the ROI anymore because they cannot connect exposure to conversion or interactions to brand lift, then it's going to lose a massive part of its value. So this is the challenge we're faced with. How do we reinvent advertising beyond third-party cookies, beyond mobile ad IDs in apps, in a way that we can still deliver on those use cases of profiling and targeting, frequency capping, measurement and attribution, in a privacy-safe world, in a way that isn't as dependent or is acceptable by browsers and operating system manufacturers? Those are the questions that are being asked to us by the market right now. You could think about 2 different ways, 2 kind of avenues that the industry has been taking to kind of address those that question. There's a let's say a cohort approach, a segmented approach, and a user ID approach. Let's look at the cohort approach first. Some initiatives, chief amongst them the Privacy Sandbox initiative that's been promoted by Google Chrome since earlier this year, are basically saying, if we don't want to have problems with user data, let's not use user data anymore, and let's use groups of users. So let's segment users on the device so that the information that comes out of the device that is available to the marketplace is at group of users level and not at user level anymore. Which sounds like an easy answer to the privacy problem, but comes with a lot of challenges. First, are we going to be able to be as relevant, right, as performant in terms of understanding of users, in terms of ability to address them, in terms of modelization of their interests, if we only operate at group level versus user level? Probably not. Think of it like using log level data versus using aggregated reporting. Very, very different capability. Are we going to be able to differentiate from each other, right? If segmentation, for instance, or attribution is calculated on the device, everybody works with the same information. How do you differentiate from each other? How are you more intelligent than your competitors? Very difficult. The competitiveness element is another one, right? How do we make sure that we can remain competitive, right? Some brands are more intelligent than others, and they're better at using data, and as a result, they have a competitive advantage. How do we maintain this? Obviously, there's a huge dependency question. Will the browser decide how we qualify users, how we attribute performance? And if yes, will they decide based on a black box algorithm that they won't share with us because that's what they do? Probably not. And last but not least, standardization. Right now, it seems to be very much a Chrome initiative. It's had apparently very little support from the other browsers. So will we have different rules, different methods to identify users or to use cohorts in Chrome, in Safari, in Firefox? Massive challenge as well. On the other side, the other kind of path, the one that we at ID5 are following, is the path of shared IDs. The principle of limiting access to third parties to the page and to identifiers means that we need to change our logic and work with IDs that are provided by the page instead of us having to, or the technology vendors having to pick up their own ID on the page, right? So this is the whole notion of shared ID. Instead of everybody speaking their own language, having their own ID to identify users, let's all work with the same ID or set of IDs that are common languages that we can all use to work with each other. No need to synchronize cookies anymore. No need to use third-party cookies because they don't have to be stored or accessible by your third party. They can just be passed to everybody by the page, by the publisher. So a very strong solution to the technical limitations, and also a way to really implement control and protection from a privacy standpoint, from a data protection standpoint as well, to ensure that the ID is only available to the people who are allowed to use data on a user. So a different way of looking at this, a way to say we can still continue to use user level data, but in a transparent, privacy compliant fashion by having shared infrastructure that everybody can work with. And there's basically two main ways to identify users, either in a shared ID kind of logic, either because users have shared information, identifiable information. Think of it as email addresses, which has been kind of really pushed forward as being the solution. It's one of the solutions, not the only one. But obviously, if a user logs in on different websites, those websites will be available to provide information that can be used to tie that user across the different websites, right? So that's what we call declared identifiers. And then there's also methods to infer the user's identifier by looking at signals such as IP address, such as user agent, such as the URL on which they've been and how long they've been on each URL, et cetera, to kind of power an algorithm that will infer the uniqueness of a user across a set of domains. And it's really important that we embrace identification in a broad mindset, because declared IDs only are not going to be sufficient. They're probably very valuable because you can power things like customer onboarding on the back of user IDs. It's obviously easier to know that the user is the same if they've told you they're the same. But it's going to be a very small portion of traffic that will be identifiable using declared IDs. And so that's why we need to combine techniques to understand who a user is, irrespective of the type of information that we have on them, so that we can limit the portion of users that are fully anonymous, because we know that they will be the least valuable for brands and publishers. So right now there's a set of providers who have kind of built solutions. This is an example of the most adopted ID solution in pre-bid, and basically they have different approaches from a reconciliation standpoint. Are they using deterministic or probabilistic method? Are they universal, or are they like IDs that are only used by one vendor? Are providers neutral, right? All of those questions are very important to understand which partner works for you as a publisher, works for you as a technology platform, and which partner you should explore with to address this question of the future of identification. ID5 has launched a service a little over a year ago now called Universal ID, which is this kind of distributed ID network, first-party ID network that over 50,000 websites now have adopted globally, and over 100 platforms, including Yieldbird, obviously, but several others, that enables publisher to pass an ID, a shared ID, to their vendors, and to use this shared ID to run audience data collection, run frequency capping, run targeting strategies, with the promise that users' privacy and publishers' data protection are respected, built into the service itself. The ID5 Universal ID service is available to any publisher. It's free of charge to publisher. It can be integrated using pre-bid, using a direct API. We've got other kind of client-side integration coming up, and basically it's an ID provided by ID5 to the publisher, to the page, that can be passed to any SSP, any DSP, any DMP data platform, et cetera, that they use to monetize their assets, in order to enable those platforms to operate without having access to their cookie ID. And as I was saying, the growth of our service over the past few years has been massive. We currently reach about 400 million users or devices per day from over 50,000 websites. Massive penetration across Europe, North America, and growing in LATAM and APAC. And there's over 100 platforms. Some of them are on this chart that are supporting either testing or fully implemented on the ID and then able to use the ID5 ID as a complement or as an alternative to their own cookie-based ID or mobile app-based ID when they don't have access to their own ID. So that's where we are. It's not a challenge that we can solve in a snap of a finger. It is an industry-wide challenge. It is something that can only be solved by the industry for the industry, which makes it a difficult challenge, right? There's a huge chicken and egg issue. How do we implement a new language? Who will learn the new language first? What's the interest of learning a new language if nobody else can talk to you with that language, right? So we rely on a lot of the key stakeholders in the industry to understand the problem and to understand the solutions that are available and to lean in and to commit and to engage and to test. Quantifying the problem is always the best way to start, right? How much are you losing when you don't have an ID? When your buyers are not able to identify their audiences? What's your average CPM on Safari and Firefox versus Chrome, for instance? What's your average CPM when you don't have a matched ID for a buyer? That will help you understand the size of the problem from a euro standpoint or a dollar standpoint or whatever currency you're working with. Once you have understood this problem, what should your strategy be? Who are the vendors that you can engage with? What is their positioning? What is their value proposition? How well does it fit your strategic direction? And then get involved. Again, this is not something that is going to be solved by a magic wand. This is something that requires a collective adoption, a collective effort. We're certainly building a lot of the infrastructure, and we have, a lot of people who are already on board. But we need more because in the end, it's going to be a scale issue, right? For us as an industry to be ready for a cookieless future, we need a big enough part of the industry to be live on a cookieless infrastructure in the next 12 months. So get involved, reach out, listen to what we have to say, and yeah, get in touch. And we'd love to work with you guys on this. Thank you for your attention.
Cool. Thanks, Mathieu. Very, very interesting presentation as always. I love those comparisons, especially because all of our publishers are asking us when we were talking about third-party cookies, how ID5 is different from LiveRamp and other companies doing the same things, more or less, but not the same exactly. So it's interesting to know your perspective on that. We have 3 questions to you. Can we take them now? Do you think we can try and tackle them?
Absolutely.
Awesome. So first one is from Frederick. Do ID5 is using any cookies for identification?
So we are using whatever storage mechanism is available to the publisher to store the ID that we provide. So in some cases, the publisher will write the ID to a first-party cookie. In some cases, they will write it to local storage. In some cases, they will be fully server-side and write it to a database. It depends. We can, and we have methods to use first-party cookies. Obviously, we use third-party cookies when they're available, but when they are not available, we can use first-party cookies or other spaces. Again, it's more of an integration question than a product design question. We don't store it ourselves. The publisher store it, and so the publisher has a lot of options to store that ID on their side.
Okay, cool. So we have a second question about your relationship with local alliances. I have NetID here as an example, but I was talking recently with a lot of publishers from Portugal, being a part of NONU. So can you tell a little more about your relation with that kind of alliances? Are you comprehensive to what they're doing, or what is the approach that you're having as the ID5?
Yeah, we are 100% supportive. We believe that publishers should engage with their users and encourage users to log in, encourage users to register, that they should tier their product and availability to their content based on the type of interaction they have. And so shared login alliances, single sign-on solutions are a great way to encourage this kind of interaction. But this is not our business. We don't provide that service. However, if you have this through a NetID or a Nonio or your own portal, we work with Prisma, for instance, the Prisma Media. They have the Prisma Media Connect, right, which is like an internal group level identifier. This is one of the signals that we can ingest to make sure that your ID, the ID that we give you, is more valuable because it's connected to, it's easier to connect to a customer record or an ID coming from another website. So we are, again, our job is to make sure that the technology ecosystem that works downstream from your site is able to identify user and to trade on a user ID, right? So it's slightly different areas of operation. We're doing a very good job, I think, integrating with the ecosystem. And we're hopeful that we'll engage with NetID and Nonio and Pass Media in France and other kind of similar local alliances to help them better monetize the data that's attached to the logins that they've built for their published clients.
Awesome. So last two questions. Philip is asking, how do you guys solve the pending loss deprecation of the IDFA? So one of the hottest topic from the last couple of weeks. Of course, it was past in time, but still a lot of publishers and advertisers are thinking about what will happen.
Yeah, it's exactly the same problem as the one we have on the web, right? As a third party, you don't have access to a consistent cross-app or cross-domain identifier, right? And so ID5 is here to solve that problem by providing a consistent cross-app or cross-domain ID. We have focused a lot over the past 12 months on the web because of the existing kind of challenges around third-party cookies and the announcement of Google a few months ago. But our service is mobile app compliant, and we are starting to deploy it through SDKs in the app world because it's exactly the same service. It works exactly the same.
Okay, cool. I hope it answers the question. And the last one, I don't know if it's a question to answer live or maybe after for the specific person, but Frederick is asking, can you share any information regarding your pricing model for buyers DSPs using your ID?
Yes, absolutely. We're charging for the access to the service. The ID that we provide to publishers is encrypted, and so we're charging for the ability to decrypt the ID. So DSPs can subscribe to the service, and the cost of the subscription is from a few $1,000s a month up to $25,000 or $30,000 a month, depending on the scale of the service. So depending on how many user IDs you will deal with on a monthly basis, with the caveat that we are right now still finishing the beta testing phase of Universal ID. So we're not charging anyone right now. So Frederick, I don't know if you work for a DSP, but if you want to get in touch and participate in the beta testing service, in the beta testing phase, more than welcome, and we won't charge you until the end of this year for using the ID5 Universal ID.